Welcome back to the Bring Our Troops Home podcast in our limited series called The Truth About Dick Cheney. This is our final episode of the series. It's episode 7, and I'm calling it The Cost and the Choice. If you've been with this series from the beginning, you've heard us talk about who Dick Cheney really was and how he was created inside of the foreign policy, executive branch, Article 2 monstrosity that we currently have. You understood his rise to power, his lived experiences working in the executive branch as the chief of staff for Gerald Ford, then moving to the legislative branch in Congress, then returning to the executive branch as the Secretary of Defense, then into private industry where he made a fortune and built allies throughout the defense contractor space. And then he returned to the executive branch again, but this time as the vice president. And when he returned, he brought with him all of his toadies and monochromatic foreign policy thinkers who believed in a unitary executive theory and the overarching concept that aligns with the neocons, that American dominance should spread democracy and Western-style government throughout the world at the barrel of a gun. This podcast and this entire series specifically is the work of our organization called Bring Our Troops Home. We are global war on terror veterans who are working within the framework of government to restrain the United States foreign policy that has been abused and twisted into something the founding fathers never intended. Although our primary grievances are in Washington, D.C., our mechanism of power, our lever of influence is in the states. And we exercise that influence through legislation called Defend the Guard, which has been introduced in over 30 states. It's a realignment of constitutional authority and the separation of powers, and it requires Congress to do their job and declare war, which they have not done, by the way, since 1942, before the states can release their National Guard into federal service for the purpose of fighting overseas wars. The National Guard has been used as an overseas occupational labor pool since the beginning of the global war on terror, violating federal law, constitutional principles, and historical norms. And we can no longer wait for Congress or the federal government to realign the use of the National Guard with the authorities that are required. It's our job as citizens to force our states through the legislature to interpose between our neighbors who serve in the National Guard and an overreaching federal government. You can learn more about the organization at bringourtroopshome.us, and you can learn more about our legislative effort at defendtheguard.us. I want to thank you for coming back to the series finale, The Truth About Dick Cheney. This is episode 7, The Cost and the Choice. The war hasn't ended. It didn't end because the cameras left. It didn't end when the network stopped covering the funerals. It didn't end when Americans returned back to their lives, their jobs, their Monday mornings. The war has kept going, and the bills have kept arriving. And the people who sent our sons and daughters into the desert never stopped to count the cost, because counting would have meant admitting what they had done. Dick Cheney's gone now. He's dead. The eulogies are finished. The flags have been returned to full staff, and the political class has moved on to the next crisis, the next scandal, the next opportunity to forget. But the cost of what he built hasn't gone anywhere. It's still here. It's still growing. It's still bleeding through the cracks of a country that never fully grasped how much was taken from it. This final episode isn't about relitigating the lies or mapping the machinery one more time. You've heard that story. You know what Cheney did. We've explained it. You know what his network engineered. You know how they bent the intelligence, bypassed Congress, and treated the Constitution like an inconvenience. This episode, it's about the price tag. It's about the one that nobody wants to count, the one that doesn't fit on a bumper sticker or inside of a cable news segment. And then it's about the choice that remains. And the only choice that matters now, whether we let the next generation inherit this system or whether we finally break it and restore it. Because Dick Cheney didn't just leave behind a doctrine, he left behind a machine. And that machine is still running. The unitary executive theory that he built sounds like something from a law school seminar. It's dry, it's academic. It's the kind of thing you'd skip if it showed up on a reading list, but that theory is the engine underneath of everything that Cheney built. It's the legal scaffolding that made the wars possible, that made the surveillance state possible, that made the torture programs and the secret prisons and the endless deployments all possible. And most Americans, they've never heard of it, and that's fine. Here's what it means in plain language, plain English, the unitary executive theory holds that the President of the United States has sole and complete control over the executive branch. That sounds reasonable until you understand what Cheney's circle did with that authority. They argued that in matters of national security, the president's authority is virtually unlimited. Congress can advise, Congress can complain, but Congress cannot restrain the commander-in-chief when he decides that a nation is under a threat. David Addington, Cheney's chief legal enforcer, built memo after memo on that foundation. John Yoo at the Justice Department turned it into official policy, and together they created a legal architecture where the president could authorize warrantless surveillance of American citizens, indefinite detention without trial, and interrogation techniques that the rest of the civilized world would simply call torture. And all of it was justified by the idea that the executive branch in wartime answers to nobody. The founders, they would not have recognized this. They would have called it monarchy. They would have fought a revolution to escape it. In fact, they did. And then they wrote a constitution specifically designed to prevent it. Article 1, Section 8 is unambiguous. It's clear. Congress declares war, not the president, not the Pentagon, not the National Security Council, the people's representatives accountable to the people, bearing the weight of a vote that history will remember. Cheney, he treated the clause like a suggestion. In fact, the 2001 authorization of use of military force gave him everything he needed. It was broad enough to cover anything, vague enough to justify everything, and spineless enough to let Congress pretend that they hadn't just surrendered the most solemn power the Constitution gives them. That authorization is still in effect 24 years later. And it's been used to justify military operations in at least 7 countries that they officially acknowledge. It was written to respond to September 11th, and it's still being invoked more than 2 decades later to send Americans into conflicts that have nothing to do with the men who attacked us. The unitary executive theory didn't die with Cheney. It's embedded now. It's institutional. Every president since has inherited it. Every administration has used it. The surveillance programs continue. The drone strikes continue. The deployments continue. And Congress continues to sit on its hands, content to let the executive branch run wars that they're too cowardly to vote on. This is Cheney's first gift to the future. A presidency unbound, a Congress hollowed out, and a country that sends its sons and daughters to fight without ever being asked to decide whether the fight is worth it. The National Guard was never supposed to be a global expeditionary force. If you don't believe me, read the Constitution, read the militia clause, and read the debates from the founding era. The militia exists for 3 purposes: to execute the laws of the Union, to suppress insurrections, and to repel invasions. That's it. Those are the words, and they're not even a little bit ambiguous. The men who wrote the language understood something that Cheney and his friends forgot or willfully ignored: that a citizen army who is tied to their communities, to their states, to their families, cannot easily be sent to fight in distant lands for unclear objectives. That's a feature of the system, not a bug. It's a structural restraint on the war power. It forces a federal government to justify the mission, to secure a declaration, to earn the consent of the governed before asking them to risk their lives and the lives of their sons and daughters. Cheney shattered that restraint, and under his doctrine, the National Guard became a strategic reserve for endless intervention. Guard units were federalized under Title X and deployed overseas in numbers that we've never seen before, not even in World War II. Soldiers who signed up to defend America, to fight and win our nation's wars when properly declared, to protect their states, to respond to emergencies, they found themselves patrolling the streets of Baghdad and Fallujah. They left behind jobs, businesses, families. They came home to find that their lives have continued without them and that they had changed in ways that they couldn't undo. And the numbers, they tell the story. More than 650,000 National Guard members deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. Some units did 3, 4, 5, or more rotations. Communities, small communities that couldn't afford to lose their firefighters, their teachers, and their sheriff's deputies, they lost them anyway. And the federal government that took them offered no declaration of war, no constitutional justification, and no accounting for why these particular Americans were being asked to carry out these particular burdens. But the transformation went far deeper than just the deployments. Today, the National Guard runs something called the State Partnership Program. It sounds benign, it sounds like diplomacy, but what it is actually different. Under this program, individual state National Guards have formal partnerships with the militaries of foreign nations, not informal relationships, not occasional exchanges, structured, ongoing partnerships that function like a defense treaty negotiated by state adjutant generals and foreign governments. Bet you didn't learn that in 6th grade civics. The scope of this is staggering. As of 2024, the state partnership program includes partnerships between American states and more than 100 foreign countries. 100 countries! Nearly half of the nations on earth have a formal military agreement, a treaty with an American state militia. And if you want to see what that looks like in practice, what it means when governors and adjutant generals start playing diplomat with citizen soldiers who sign up to defend their own states, their own communities, let's look no further than Arizona. In 2023, Defend the Guard passed the Arizona State Senate. Our bill champion was State Senator Wendy Rogers, a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel and a combat pilot who understood exactly what was at stake. The bill was being transmitted to the House, where it would work through the legislative process before landing on Governor Katie Hobbs's desk. While that was happening, the Arizona legislators were debating whether their own National Guard should be protected from unconstitutional deployments. Governor Hobbs and the Arizona Adjutant General, Major General Kerry Mullenbeck, they got on a plane. They flew halfway around the world to Oman, and they signed a state partnership agreement committing Arizona citizen soldiers to a formal military agreement with a Middle Eastern nation on the Arabian Peninsula. Not the southern border of Arizona, not the border where drug traffickers and illegal aliens were flooding across in record numbers, not the border where fentanyl was pouring into American communities and killing American kids. No, the border that Governor Hobbs committed to defend was Oman's southwestern frontier, where they were facing insurgency spillover from Yemen. Let's think about that for just a moment. At the time the agreement was signed, the United States was actively engaged in combat operations in Yemen under the 2001 authorization of use of military force. That's right, the one that was signed 23 years earlier for Afghanistan was being used to put American troops in Yemen. And now we had a military agreement, a contract with the state's militia and Yemen's neighbor, Oman. American forces were fighting in Yemen. There were drone strikes, special operations, the full apparatus of the forever war grinding away in another country most Americans have no idea about. So while our military was stirring the hornet's nest in Yemen, our state militias were being committed to Oman to help keep any refugees or civilians trying to evacuate the war that we were fighting from crossing into Omani territory. We were creating the chaos on one side of the border and then promising to clean it up on the other side. With Arizona's Guard, without a declaration of war, without a vote from Congress, without the Arizona legislature even being consulted. Which mission matters more, defending the United States southern border with the militia, the National Guard from Arizona, or handing that National Guard unit, that militia from Arizona, over to the federal government so they can serve the Sultan of a Middle Eastern nation? And while all of this was happening, while General Mullenbeck was jetting off to sign a de facto treaty with a foreign government, what was the command climate like back home? Arizona Guardsmen watched their leadership use the COVID vaccine mandate as a purge mechanism, pushing out experienced soldiers who refused to comply. They sat through DEI sensitivity training sessions when they should have been learning how to operate weapons systems and communication equipment and how to function as a cohesive military unit. Readiness, actual readiness, took a backseat to compliance. Training took a backseat to cultural alignment, and the mission took a backseat to bureaucratic box checking. Now, I'm not arguing that General Mullenbeck woke up every morning thinking about DEI. I'm arguing that during her tenure, Arizona Guardsmen experienced a command climate where compliance, cultural alignment, and bureaucracy felt more important than trust, training, and readiness. And that perception didn't come from nowhere. And I would suggest, in fact, I'm not going to suggest, I'm just going to say it outright, that focusing on some feel-good international show of force with Arizona's citizen soldiers was more important to that leadership than training, equipping, and prepping for Arizona National Guard to do the job it actually exists to do. Defend the homeland, respond to real domestic emergencies, and secure the southern border and protect Arizona. That is the Guard that Cheney left behind. Not a state defense force accountable to governors and legislatures, and to the citizens who they serve, but a global deployment arm for a federal government that stopped asking permission decades ago, commanded by officers more interested in international partnerships and progressive credentials than combat readiness and constitutional fidelity. We couldn't properly end this series if we didn't talk about the numbers, because the numbers are so large that they became abstractions. And I think that's the trick, actually. That's how the war machine survives, because if you can turn suffering into statistics, then you can bury it inside of a spreadsheet. You can discuss it calmly at think tank panels. You can mention it briefly before moving on to the next agenda item. But these massive numbers, they're not abstractions. They are actually people. And the Cost of War project at Brown University has spent years trying to count what the post 9/11 wars actually cost. Their numbers are the most rigorous available, and they are devastating. The total death toll across the war zones, including Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and the other countries where American operations occurred, approaches, are you ready for this? 4.5 million people. It's not a mistake. I said it right. More than 900,000 died from direct violence. The rest, they died from the collapse of infrastructure, the destruction of hospitals and water systems, the displacement and starvation that follows when a society is shattered by war. 38 million people were displaced. 38 million. They were ripped from their homes, from their communities, their entire way of life. They became refugees in their own countries or fled across borders into camps and cities that couldn't absorb them. The ripple effect of that displacement are still playing out today. The migration crisis, the political instability, the generational trauma that follows people who watch their entire worlds disappear. The refugees that are relocated by NGOs into our communities, near our homes, or who cross our border illegally. These refugees, they change entire communities. They burden our infrastructure. They change American elections and community identity overnight. But the cost isn't only measured in foreign graves and foreign displacement and migration. It's measured here at home in veterans who came home and found that they couldn't actually come home. It's found in the men and women who survived the battlefield only to lose the war inside of their own minds. Because more than 30,000 post 9/11 veterans have died by their own hand. And that number is more than 4 times the number who died in combat. Listen to that again. We lost more veterans to suicide after they came home than we lost to the entire enemy fire while they were deployed and fighting overseas. The VA's own data shows that veterans die by suicide rate roughly 50% higher than non-veterans. And for women veterans, the rate is 90% higher than civilian women. The first year after leaving service is the most dangerous. The transition from combat to civilian life, from a world where every moment had structure and meaning to a world that doesn't understand what you've been through. It kills more veterans than any enemy combatant. And the system that sent them to war, the system that used them and discarded them, has never adequately answered for it. But for the National Guard, it's actually quite different. And nobody ever talks about how it's different or why it's different. Because when active duty soldiers come home from combat, they remain in the military and in a military posture. They're stateside with their military units and military hospitals and military communities. They continue military training. They wear military uniforms. They prepare for their next military engagement. They advance their military careers. In fact, the deployment multiplies their promotability. The structure remains, their identity remains, and the support system in their peer group, it remains. But when Guard soldiers come home, they try to reinsert into civilian life, back to the businesses that they own and operate, back to jobs that they had to leave and that had to be backfilled by a replacement, back to their homes where life continued without them, to communities that don't understand where they've been or what they've seen. They try to get treatment for combat injuries in the civilian marketplace, often nowhere near a VA hospital, separated from a peer group that might actually understand what it is that they're carrying. Then they're called back again. Another deployment, They leave the civilian life again, the business, the jobs, the homes, the families. They reinsert into military life. They deploy again. They come home and they reinsert into civilian life again. And that accordion effect, that conversion from soldier to citizen and from citizen to soldier, each time it becomes more familiar. It might even become easier logistically, but the connective tissue, the elasticity in their emotional system is strained to new levels. New frustrations compound on pre-existing wounds, and the seams, they start to show in the fabric. It starts to tear. And that weight on National Guard soldiers is different. And it's never really been explained. It's never been talked about. Now, I'm not naive enough to say that Guardsmen sign up just to fill sandbags during floods. You're never going to hear those words come out of my mouth. And when our nation calls and the security of our country needs citizen soldiers to temporarily lay down their tradesman tools, take off their civilian gear, and put on a military uniform, National Guardsmen are the most patriotic people in the country, and they will do it willingly. And if our nation needs us to fight a war, we should be the force that gets called. We should be the ones who fight and win America's wars. That is an honor of a patriotic American. But it comes with an understanding that we will not be asked to do things by our country at the command of an individual without following a process. And that process is simple. It's in the Constitution. If the people have given their expressed informed consent, then it needs to be demonstrated through a vote and a declaration of war by our representatives in Congress. And if that happens, there is not a single National Guardsman in this country who wouldn't immediately lay down their civilian life, pick up their military one, and storm the beach. We're not asking for an excuse to avoid service. We're demanding that the service be constitutional. And that's not weakness, folks. That's the deal. That's what the founders intended. And that's what the Cheney doctrine destroyed. These are the sons and daughters who believed what they were told. They trusted their leaders. They trusted the intelligence. They trusted the mission was real and the sacrifice would be worth it. Then they came home and they learned the truth. They learned about the manipulated intelligence, the invented connections between Saddam and Al-Qaeda, the weapons programs that didn't actually exist. They learned that the foundation of the war was a lie. And that knowledge doesn't heal, it festers. It turns sacrifice into betrayal. And for far too many, it becomes unbearable. Now we get to talk about the money. Specifically, $8 trillion. That is the direct cost of the post 9/11 wars as calculated by the Cost of Wars Project at Brown University. That's not including the interest on the debt that we incurred to pay for the war. It's not including the future costs of veteran care that will continue for decades. And for context, $8 trillion, it's more than the combined GDP of every single country in Africa combined. It's more than the United States spent on the entire New Deal adjusted for inflation. It's more than we've invested in our infrastructure, our schools, our healthcare systems, our crumbling bridges, the outdated power grids. And it disappeared into a desert, into contracts for companies like Halliburton and KBR, into bases that were built and abandoned, into equipment that was destroyed or left behind, into a project that achieved none of its stated objectives and created chaos that will take generations to resolve. But the bill, it's still not even finished because the VA, they estimate that the healthcare and disability costs for post 9/11 veterans will reach between 2.2 and 2.5 trillion over the next coming decades. That money hasn't been budgeted for yet, and it's an obligation that we've incurred without any plan to pay for it. The veterans who served are aging. Their injuries are compounding. The traumatic brain injuries, the chemical exposures, the psychological wounds, all of it requires care that the system is not prepared to provide. Meanwhile, we've built a global military presence that dwarfs anything in human history. The United States, are you ready for this? The United States operates more than 750 military bases in over 80 countries. Some estimates place that number even higher. We have 3 times more overseas bases than every other country on earth combined. More than 170,000 active duty troops are stationed on foreign soil at any given moment. Japan owes over 50,000, Germany 34,000, South Korea has 23,000. And what about the National Guard? Our home defense force. Well, at any given moment over the past 2 years, estimates suggest between 22 and 55,000 National Guard troops are stationed outside the continental United States at any one point. Recently, Illinois National Guardsmen were deployed to Operation Spartan Shield in Iraq. Virginia's Guard was in Poland. Wisconsin was in Kosovo. Texas was in Estonia. Indiana was sent to unclassified areas of the Middle East. Very cute. Oh, and by the way, the Florida National Guard was in Ukraine when the Russian invasion started. Let's just unpack that for half a second. The Florida National Guard, absent from their state, serving in some undisclosed purpose in Ukraine when Russia invaded. We could have been dragged into a hot war with a nuclear superpower because the National Guard from an American southern state was overseas in an official military capacity, and they were effectively serving as a tripwire for a nuclear war. Folks, that is not made up. That is a real threat. That is what this system produces. Citizen soldiers from Florida who signed up to defend their nation and their state, to protect their communities, and to respond to hurricanes were positioned in a foreign country as human tripwires for a conflict between great powers. No declaration, no vote, no debate, just deployment orders and a hope that nothing goes wrong. But here's what should disturb you. This should bother you. The Pentagon, they don't regularly publish any daily or monthly breakdown for Guard deployments the way it does for active duty. I wonder why. I couldn't find a single reference from any media organization, any congressional committee, any politician that ever asked the Department of Defense or the National Guard Bureau to identify the total number of National Guard soldiers currently outside the continental United States. I searched, I promise, for hours. The question simply doesn't exist. And the reason there's no answer anywhere is because no one has ever asked the damn question. But why don't they ask? Because this has become normal. And I talked about this a little bit in episode 6, that Dick Cheney's legacy can be summed up in one sentence. He successfully made endless, forever undeclared wars boring. And when something becomes boring, it doesn't draw attention from those who are supposed to have their eyes and ears open, asking the important questions. The journalists stop covering it. The politicians grandstanding about it. The committees stop holding hearings. The machine keeps running, and nobody notices because noticing requires effort, and effort requires interest, and there's no interest because it's just background noise now. It's just the hum of the empire. See, the founders, they didn't give us a free press as a luxury. They gave it to us as a vanguard of defense. It's not an opposition party. It's not a cheer squad. It's a forward element whose job is to sniff out deception, to challenge power, to take the first hit when the truth made people uncomfortable. A vanguard doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't ask what's safe. It goes where power would rather it not go, because that's where danger usually is. The fourth estate, the media, it was supposed to have a bloodhound's nose for lies. And when the stories don't add up, when the timelines conflict, when the justifications feel rehearsed, the press was supposed to dig, not echo, not sanitize, dig. Its job wasn't to comfort the public or protect institutions. It was to pry, to question, and to shine the white-hot spotlight into the darkest corners of power. In a constitutional republic, the press is part of the national defense. And when it fails, wars get sold instead of debated. Power concentrates and accountability dies quietly without anybody noticing, because the people who were supposed to notice stop doing their jobs. And when that vanguard fails, the rest of the system is left blind. And we've been blind for more than 20 years. But the questions that I raised earlier, they are asked. But they're asked internally, in quiet moments, in the veterans' minds when they come home. They ask themselves, how many of my brothers and sisters are still deployed to these nonsensical misadventures? Where are they right now? Does anybody know? Does anybody even care? This isn't defense. Defense is protecting the homeland. This is an empire, and empires are expensive. They're expensive in treasure, they're expensive in blood, and eventually they are expensive in ways that destroy the republic that they are supposed to protect. Now, the damage caused by these forever wars and this mess that Dick Cheney left us isn't just fiscal or physical. It's spiritual. Because something broke in this country when we accepted the premise that our leaders could lie us into war and face no consequences. Something broke when we normalized indefinite detention, when we shrugged at torture, when we allowed our government to operate secret prisons beyond the reach of any law. Because when Cheney left office, he wrote a memoir. He gave interviews defending everything he'd done. He was treated as an elder statesman. He was invited to speak. He was consulted on matters of national security. And the architects of the Iraq War, the people who manipulated the intelligence and sold the catastrophe as a cakewalk, they went on to comfortable retirements, to think tank fellowships and cable news contributor contracts, and nobody was held accountable. Nobody faced consequences. So what does that teach the next generation of leaders? It teaches them that power protects itself. It teaches them that the rules apply to everybody except the people at the top. It teaches them that if you can send thousands of Americans to die on false pretenses, and the worst that would happen is you might have to answer some uncomfortable questions at a book signing. The moral rot, it extends beyond the individual actors. It's institutional now. The intelligence community learned that shaping analysis to match policy is survivable. The Pentagon learned that endless war is a business model. Congress learned that avoiding hard votes is easier than defending them. The media learned that access matters more than accountability. And every institution that should have served as a check on the executive overreach instead adapted to it. It accommodated it, and ultimately it enabled it. We tell ourselves that America is exceptional. We tell ourselves that our system of checks and balances makes us different from the empires of the past. But the checks didn't check. The balances didn't balance. And the people who were supposed to stand between the government and unconstitutional war instead stepped aside and let the machine roll forward. And the world noticed. Before 2001, the United States was viewed around the world as powerful, but generally restrained. That doesn't mean that we were universally loved or beyond criticism, but global polling from the late 1990s showed a strong favorability across Europe, Asia, Latin America, and even parts of the Middle East. People distinguished between American foreign policy decisions and American values. We were seen as imperfect, sometimes hypocritical, but fundamentally oriented towards a rules-based order. The country that helped end the Cold War without catastrophe, the country that worked through coalitions, the shining city on the hill. That perception, though, collapsed after 2001. And within a few years of the Iraq invasion, global favorability towards the United States dropped sharply across nearly every region on earth. And in many Muslim majority countries, favorability fell into the single digits. Not surprising. And this isn't about hating our freedoms like we were told. Polling from that era shows concrete reasons: preemptive war, large-scale civilian casualties, perceived dishonesty about weapons and motives, open-ended military occupations with no clear end sight. Those are the actual reasons. And more than 2 decades later, the numbers haven't recovered. Pew Research just recently did a survey and found fewer than half of the respondents across 24 countries viewed the United States' favorability low. Gallup's tracking, it shows a long, steady decline since 2001, and it's never returned to pre-9/11 levels. Even among NATO allies, confidence in American leadership has remained low across all administrations. It's not partisan. It isn't about one president. It's structural. And the United States is no longer broadly seen as that shining city on a hill. Increasingly, we are viewed as an empire with troops on foreign soil, conducting wars that kill civilians, enforcing outcomes without accountability, and expanding our military footprint without clear limits or objectives. And what makes that rot even deeper is the selectivity. We intervene in the affairs of supposed allies for morally questionable purposes while turning a blind eye to some of the worst atrocities on the planet. Our argument about moral superiority is overshadowed by our eagerness to appease powerful foreign lobbies and corporate interests. Our relationships with wealthy nations are contingent on lucrative arms contracts for defense contractors whose offices sit in the shadows of the Capitol dome. We sell weapons to regimes that use them on civilians. We look away from genocide when it's inconvenient. We lecture the world about human rights while partnering with governments that essentially have none. The world sees it. They're not fooled. And the moral authority that America once had, the credibility that made American leadership meaningful, has been squandered by men who believe power was its own justification. But I want to be really clear here. I think it's important that we recognize that the rot is in the machinery. It's in the men who operate the machine. It's in the foreign policy establishment that treated the Constitution like an obstacle and American lives like expendable resources. It's not in the American people, because we are a nation built by great and moral people. The men and women who serve in uniform, the families who wait at home, the communities that send their best and pray for their safe return. They're not the disease. They're the ones who paid the price for decisions they never made and the lies that they never told. The moral rot of the perpetrators is ours to own, though. It's ours. We got it. It falls on us as Americans, not because we caused it, but because we inherited it. And because what bad people destroyed, good people can fix. That's the rot that Cheney left behind. It's not in our character. It's in our institutions. It's in our standing. It's in the soul of the republic that forgot what it was supposed to be. But a republic has a memory. It can remember. The people who built it can rebuild it. As a moral people, what do we do now? Cheney's dead. His network is scattered, and the wars, I guess you might argue that they're winding down. I get it. There's other ones that are starting, but we have a moment. So is it enough to tell the truth and just hope somebody listens? I'll answer that for you. It's not, because the machine, it's still running. The authorities are still in place. The 2001 AUMF is still active. They're using it and citing it for authorizations. And just look recently, Iran, Venezuela. None of what's happening today is accidental. It's built on what Dick Cheney started in 2001. The unitary executive theory is still embedded in how the government operates. In fact, over the last 8 years, it's been put on steroids. The National Guard is still available for deployments to any conflict that the president chooses, without a declaration, without a vote, without constitutional authority. Telling the truth is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We have to break the machine. And there's only one place left where that's possible, and that's in the states. Daniel Webster, former Secretary of State, United States Senator, United States Congressman, he understood this all the way back in 1814. When the federal government sought to conscript state militiamen for an undeclared war, Webster stood in Congress and delivered a warning that echoes across 2 centuries. He said that it would be the solemn duty of the state governments to protect their own authority over their own militia and to interpose between their citizens and an arbitrary power. Those are among the objects for which a state government exists. Interposition. That's the word. When the federal government exceeds its constitutional authority, the states have not merely the right, but the duty to step between Washington and their own citizens, to say no, to refuse compliance, to force the issue back to the constitutional foundation. And that's what Defend the Guard does. The concept is simple. It's state legislation that prohibits the deployment of the state's National Guard to active combat overseas unless Congress has passed a formal declaration of war, as required by Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution. It doesn't say anything about an authorization for use of military force, not a resolution, not a signing statement, a declaration of war. The thing the Constitution actually requires. The thing Congress hasn't had the balls to do since 1942. The legal architecture already supports this. Title 10 of the United States Code, it governs how the National Guard can be federalized. And this is the part that nobody ever talks about. The first section of that law, Section 12301, it says that the National Guard can be ordered into active duty in time of war declared by Congress. It's right there. the very first paragraph of the very first section, the requirement for a congressional declaration is written into the very statute that governs Guard activations, and it mirrors the Constitution. But they just ignore it. Subsequent sections of the same code after 12301, it gives other reasons the National Guard may be activated into federal service, but based on the priority order of the way the law is built, these are exceptions. These are other ways. They're never to trump the first one, which is a congressional declaration. You can't activate the Guard for another purpose or another authorization found further in the code to get around the requirement for the first criteria, which is to serve in war declared by Congress. Section 12302 says the president can activate the Guard for national emergency if he declares an actual national emergency. Section 12304 allows activation when the president determines it's necessary to augment active forces. Listen to that. Section 12304 is the loophole that they've exploited. That's how they get around the war clause. They claim they're not sending the Guard to war, they're just augmenting forces. But that authority does not erase what comes before it. You can't use 12304 to augment troops fighting an undeclared war overseas and pretend that 12301 doesn't exist. Augmentation doesn't override the requirement for a declaration. If the forces being augmented are engaged in combat abroad, you are back to the war clause again. The baseline, the foundation, is right there in the very first section, 12301, the first section of the law. And for 20 years, they've pretended that it doesn't exist. There are a plethora of reasons the National Guard can be activated into federal service, but specifically to serve overseas in foreign wars, wars of choice, they must be declared by Congress. All of the purposes identified in the law are secondary to the war clause. That's not my interpretation. That's how the statute is written. Defend the Guard simply enforces, in fact, it forces compliance with what the law and the Constitution already demand. Defend the Guard, it doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't petition the federal government to please follow your own rules. It tells the federal government that until you meet your constitutional obligations, this state's Guard stays home. It puts the burden where it belongs, on Congress to do its job or to lose access to the citizen soldiers that they are treating as a free expeditionary force. The objections, they're predictable. National security requires flexibility. The president needs to respond to threats quickly. We can't tie the commander-in-chief's hands in a dangerous world. We've heard all of this before. It's all the same bullshit that Cheney made. It's the same arguments that every advocate for unchecked executive power has made since the founding of our country. And the founders, they rejected it. They rejected it because they understood that power to take a nation into war is the most dangerous power that a government can possess. They understood that concentrating that power in one person's hands is the definition of tyranny. They built a system specifically designed to prevent it. Defend the Guard doesn't weaken national security. It restores constitutional order. It forces the question that the political class has been avoiding for decades. If a war is worth fighting, then it's worth voting for. If it's worth asking Americans to stand up and potentially die, then it's worth asking their representatives to stand up and to put their name on the line. We've been trying to fix this from the top down for more than 20 years, and it doesn't work. The federal government will not restrain itself. The people in power have no incentive to limit their own power. The change has to come from the states. It has to come from the legislatures that answer to their own citizens, their neighbors. It has to come from governors who understand that the Guard belongs to the people, not to the Pentagon. This is the fight. This is what remains. Not hope as an emotion, but action as a strategy. Not waiting for Washington to correct itself, but forcing the correction from outside. The more gray I get in my beard and the higher my hairline recedes, the more I think about the next generation. About the ones who were born after 9/11, who have never known an America at peace, who grew up believing that endless war is just how things are. They didn't choose this. They inherited it. And unless we do something, they're going to pass it on to their children. I often think about my friend Aaron. I think about the thousands just like him. Ones who came home carrying wounds that nobody could see, the ones who trusted their leaders and then learned too late that trust had been misplaced. The ones who aren't here anymore because the weight of what they learned became too much to carry. Their sacrifice means nothing if we don't change the system that consumed them. Their memory is just sentiment if we let the next Cheney do it all over again. The only way to honor what they gave us is to make sure no future generation pays the same price for the same lies. Thank God Dick Cheney's gone. But the fight, it's not over. It's just entering a new phase. The phase where we stop studying the problem and we start fixing it. The phase where we stop asking permission and start demanding accountability. The phase where the states remember their duty and the citizens remember their power. Now, if you've stayed with this series, you understand what happened. You understand how we got here. Now the question is, what are you going to do about it? Join us. Go to bringourtroopshome.us and click the Join Us tab. Add your name to the movement of veterans and citizens who refuse to let this continue. Then visit defendtheguard.us and sign the petition. Make your voice part of the record. And if you can, chip in a few bucks at bringourtroopshome.us/remnant. Every single dollar goes towards this work, telling the truth, building a coalition, and passing Defend the Guard in every state. The Constitution isn't just a document, it's a promise. It's a promise that power will be checked, that leaders will be accountable, that the decision to send Americans to war will never rest in one person's hands. Dick Cheney broke that promise. He shattered it. But we can restore it. But only if we fight, only if we act, and only if we refuse to let the future become another version of the past. The choice is ours. The future's watching. Thanks for joining us for this podcast series, The Truth About Dick Cheney. I hope you found it entertaining. I hope you found it educational. I hope it bothers you so you can't sleep tonight. And if you can't, check us out on all of our social media at Troops Home US, specifically on X. Follow the movement. Join in. We'd love to have you on our team.